So we want to move on and talk, and actually it's sort of, it coincides with the question that was asked about, legal imperatives and what should states do about things like displacement, migration and so on. So we're looking at legal and policy responses. And obviously, one of the things that we have to ask is, does the law, do we as citizens in democratic countries, is there a requirement that the law reflects some kind of moral imperative to act when we see injustice, when we see displacement, etc.? So I want to ask Anya Ryall, what legal frameworks or principles can be used in this kind of minefield that we're talking about? And are there reforms needed, which I imagine there are? So over to you.
Thank you, Mary. And I think it's important to begin by just stepping back for a minute so that we can set the scene and explain more clearly where the law fits in this particular conversation. And everybody in this room, I'm sure, is very well aware of the urgency of the climate challenge, what is at stake, in particular for future generations, as we heard from Phil. And we continue, of course, to see what I describe as the totally inadequate political responses, not just here in Ireland at the national level, but also, of course, disappointingly at international level also. And we all know that there are, of course, very powerful economic interests at play here, who have a very strong vested interest in the status quo. So that's what we're up against, and the law operates against that background. It's not surprising then, of course, to find citizens, environmental NGOs, community action groups, individuals, whoever it might be, turning to the law to see what can the law do? How can we deploy law to try to effectively force governments to act responsibly as regards the climate challenge? And before turning to the specifics of what exactly the law can offer, I think it's important just to make two background points that we simply cannot afford to lose sight of. The first is that people generally have very high expectations of the law, and sometimes the law simply cannot and does not live up to those expectations. So it's important in a group like this that we remain realists and that what we propose is pragmatic and has a very solid evidence and legal base. And the point I'm attempting to make here is that it's a simple one. Just because you have a law doesn't necessarily mean that the problem is going to be solved. And the Pope in his encyclical mentions implementation and the importance of monitoring. So the law isn't it's part of the solution, but there's more to it than that. And we are all very familiar, unfortunately, with blatant breaches of human rights law, breaches of planning law here in Ireland, breaches of environmental law. So we must keep in mind implementation and compliance. That's the first point, that the law will get us only so far. The second point, then, is a very pragmatic point, and it concerns access to the courts, or access to justice, as it's more commonly known. And many of you in this room, again, who may have been very involved in various social justice campaigns, will be well aware that getting access to the Irish courts is not cheap. There are very high legal costs involved here, and it's usually only the brave or the very well-resourced who will go to court. And there is a real lack of funding, maybe public funding, for public interest litigation, not just in the area of climate, but in environmental law and other social justice issues more generally. So that is important too. If one is to litigate in Ireland, for example, how would you fund that type of litigation? How would you use law most effectively as a campaigning tool, as part of your strategy for reform, as part of your strategy for social change? So that's the second point about access to the courts. So turning then to the specifics, there is already a very wide range of legal principles out there that enable us to identify and to seek to hold states to account where they do fail to act responsibly on climate change. So there is certainly law out there, and the various bodies of law that tend to be drawn upon most commonly in the field of climate is, of course, international human rights law, the European Convention on Human Rights, tort law, which some of you may have heard of. That tends to be what's been used most specifically in the United States context at the moment. The human rights side of things tends to be more prevalent here in Europe, certainly for now. But by tort law, we're usually talking about private land or private property interests, impacts on human health, for example. But again, it's one specific tool that might be deployed, as well, of course, as national planning and environmental laws. So there are a whole suite of legal principles out there that could be used, but this is a fairly new area of law and practice. We talk of climate change law, climate change liability, climate change litigation, very rapidly moving, and there are lots of people out there pushing the boundaries. And I suppose my job today, I see it as being to give you some possibilities or some templates, some examples as to where things might perhaps evolve here in Ireland. And what lawyers in this field are effectively doing is they're taking pre-existing legal principles that are well known to all of us. We heard Mary Robinson yesterday speak about how her foundation is using climate justice to develop a more human rights framework around the whole climate challenge. And that's a very powerful approach, and it's gathering momentum through organisations like the International Bar Association and others. So there are a lot of things happening. But for us in Ireland, what we need to do is to effectively fit those legal principles into the climate challenge, or essentially try to crowbar the issues that we're trying to address into pre-existing principles. And that requires innovation, it requires imagination on the part of lawyers, and it requires brave plaintiffs to step up, willing to move these things forward and move through the courts if necessary. And there is one very interesting case that's currently working its way through the courts in the Netherlands. Many of you will have heard of this case. It's the Urgenda Foundation's case, which is a case being taken by this Urgenda Foundation against the Dutch government. It involves over 900 plaintiffs acting collectively, so this is a large-scale operation. It alleges very simply that the Dutch government is violating their rights by not taking sufficient action on climate change. Now, that litigation was filed in the District Court in The Hague in November 2013. The case was heard in court in April of this year, and we heard already how this conference's timing has been perfect with the encyclical, and would you believe, according to the Urgenda Foundation, judgment in that case is due to be delivered in The Hague tomorrow, June 24th. So, what it'll bring, we're not sure, but it's certainly one to watch. I'm no expert in Dutch law, but I would imagine that if the result isn't what the government is happy with, they may well appeal to a higher court, so this is unlikely to be the end of that litigation. But it's important, I think, to just spell out very briefly what the essentials of that Dutch case are. Typical of much litigation, people seek declarations from the court, a statement that the government is in breach of particular obligations. And the declaration or the statement from the court that Urgenda are seeking is that global warming of greater than 2 degrees Celsius will lead to a violation of human rights worldwide. Will lead to a violation of human rights worldwide. So they're certainly using the human rights framework and taking a very broad approach. They also want a declaration that the Dutch government is acting unlawfully by not contributing its proportional share to prevent global climate change. So again, a number of different perspectives here, and certainly a lot that we can learn perhaps from how this particular case has been crafted by the Dutch lawyers. And then, of course, this is the bite, the meat of the litigation. They want a court order. Now, there's no guarantee they'll get it. We'll have to wait and see. But they want a court order requiring, effectively, the Dutch government to drastically reduce Dutch emissions, even before 2020, to the level determined by scientists to be such as to keep within the less than 2 degrees threshold. And that, according to your agenda, would mean reducing Dutch emissions by 40% by 2020. So they've taken the science and crowbarred it into their legal arguments. Crowbar is a bit inelegant, but that's effectively what has to be done here. This is a new area of law. We've seen it before in constitutional law and the evolution of modern environmental law. New ideas to be fitted into an old framework and then pushing things forward. So I would commend very much the Urgenda documentation to you. It's on their website. The summons, that's the legal case, it's nearly 200 pages long. It's full of science and law, the human rights side of things, much of the themes actually that we've heard, not just this morning, but yesterday as well. So perfect timing, as they say. Very quickly then, Belgium has then, the Belgian NGOs and individuals have followed the Dutch lead, and they too have now filed suit against their government. And I think this is beginning to gain momentum, and it's something we here in Ireland want to watch. If you're a lawyer, you never really want to be the first. You want to let the others go before you and see what happens. But sometimes, it's good to be the first as well. But I think, we just have to see what happens elsewhere. A point too that might be of use for those of you who are really interested in this area, there is a lot happening worldwide. This isn't an environmental law conference, so I'm just picking some of the best incidents. But Columbia Law School in New York have a very, very impressive climate litigation database where they've effectively tracked all the climate litigation right throughout the world, and they've set it out by jurisdiction if you want to see what's happening where, and they do keep it fairly up to date, so I would recommend that resource to you. So finally then, with the view to finishing up, I just want to come back very briefly to the interconnectedness point. We talked about science, politics and morality being very interconnected, but it's essential that the law goes in there as well. I'm not just a lawyer, I'm also an educator, I work in a university, and I think in terms of moving this forward, the law alone simply won't be enough. We have to feed it into all the other campaigning actions that we've heard so much about, important things like the Green Campus Initiative, evidence and advocacy from the universities, and John Sweeney's contribution this morning, so important in that regard. Interestingly, it was Andrew Cosgrave from Scouting Ireland yesterday who was the only person to mention the law yesterday. Scouts law, leave no trace, which is simple but effective. So I think that's interesting. And what John said about the climate bill, obviously we could talk about that forever. But he stole my point, and I'll finish on this. It's that if the politicians don't hear people at the doorsteps saying, what are you going to do about climate change? What are you going to do about climate change? It doesn't matter to them. I mean, they're hearing about the big things, of course, healthcare, jobs, taxation, the USC charges, water charges. So why are they not hearing about climate change? And is that somehow down to us to get that message out there, however we manage to do it, so that climate change and climate law is what the politicians are hearing at the doorsteps? So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.